In this video, we'll take a look at the process of creating a pen and ink drawing of a horse from start to finish. Now, this video is a time lapse taken from a complete lesson series. This complete lesson series is available to members at thevirtualinstructor.com. If you're interested in learning from this complete 5-hour lesson series, just head over to thevirtualinstructor.com/members. If you're not already a member, you can check out our program. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy this video. So we'll begin by first mapping out our picture plane. And in this case, I've made our picture plane the exact same size as the photo reference. This, of course, will help as we're laying out the basic structure of the horse. And you'll see here that we're starting with just basic shapes. So we're just laying out the basic shapes of the structure of the head and the neck and the upper portion of the body of the horse. And we're drawing loosely here with an F or a H graphite pencil because we know that these marks are going to be erased later in the process after we apply the ink. So once we've got the basic outer contours of the horse in place, then we can start developing some of the details. And even as we're developing the details, the lines here are rather loose and sketchy. We're going to refine all of the lines with the pen and ink applications. Now at this stage, I'm going in and I'm mapping out the areas where we see dark and light values along with additional details. In this case, you can see we're developing the eye here. And by mapping out the areas of dark and light values, when we start making the pen and ink applications, we already have a good idea of where the values should change. And this, of course, allows us to concentrate on the marks that we make with the pen and ink and not so much about if we're in the right location for the different values. Are we placing the values in the right location? If we can get all that worked out in the early stages where we're creating the pencil drawing, then it's going to be advantageous to us. You can see here that I went back and erased the eye and changed the size of that. That's always going to be something that's part of the drawing process, no matter what medium you're working with. And so don't be afraid to go back and make changes, and make those changes as soon as you see them. So here I'm continuing to define some of the dark and light areas, the shapes of those values, and we'll also go ahead and define the shapes for the mane. The mane is going to be an important element in this drawing. It's a textural difference. Basically, the texture of the fur of the horse is different than the texture that we'll see in the mane, of course. Right, once we've got our pencil sketch in place, we can begin making the pen and ink applications. And in this case, I stick with the same size pen throughout this process. We're going to vary the line a little bit, but we're going to be using the same pen throughout the process to develop the pen and ink portion. In this case, I'm using a Staedtler 0.05 millimeter pen. And this pen is one of the smallest ones that you can use here, even though this drawing is kind of a medium-sized pen and ink drawing. Now, as we start developing the pen and ink applications, you'll notice that I'm very deliberate about the directional strokes that I make with the pen. We want to make sure that the strokes that we make not only communicate the texture of the fur that's on, or the hair that's on the side of the horse, but also we want to make sure that we are communicating some information about the form as well. So when we're making lines that flow over the form of a subject, this is often referred to as cross contour lines, and cross contour lines can tell us a lot about the form. The directional strokes that we make, of course, should flow over the form. So you'll notice that these strokes that I'm making with the pen change direction according to the different locations of the body of the horse, the head and the neck, and so on. I'm also trying to keep my stroking fairly consistent, so I'm using mostly hatching to develop the value. Value, of course, is the darkness or lightness of a color, and value, of course, tells us a lot about the form of the subject as well as the light within the scene. And so we want to make sure that we have a full range of value. And by concentrating the marks that we make, we can create darker values. And by allowing more space between the marks, we create lighter values. And with pen and ink drawing, it's a good idea to basically start with lighter applications, because you can always go back and make areas darker. If you make an area too dark, then it's very difficult, if not impossible, to fix that. So you'll see here that I cover areas with a light application first, and then I'll go back and make areas darker when the time is right. It's also important to understand that value is relative. That means that it's all dependent on the other values around it. So we might understand a value to be a dark value simply because there are a lot of light values around it. And the reverse of that is true. So once we start getting some of these values on the paper, then we can start to really evaluate how we've pushed the value range. So we might need to go back in certain circumstances and push the values darker. So as we work up to this area underneath the eye on the side of the face, you can see that we're creating somewhat of a bulge here, and that's all due to the directional stroking that's happening here. And we have a lot of power with the strokes that we make with a pen, of course. We can really inform the viewer of the form of each individual section. You can see this happening here before your eyes. So again, just to reiterate, I'm using mostly hatching to develop the value in the texture. You might be tempted to use cross-hatching, and cross-hatching is used in just a couple of areas within this drawing, but I've found that with organic subjects such as this, cross-hatching can tend to make the drawing look flat. And it's sometimes a better idea just to stick with hatching and just to vary the amount of space that you place between each line to build up the value. You really don't have to use cross-hatching to get some of those areas where the value is really dark. You can really just concentrate the lines to create those nice rich dark values. And you can see this happening on the lower portion of the head here as we're starting to get some of those concentrated marks. You'll also notice that I bounce around a little bit as we're developing the head, and this goes back to what I said before. Once we start getting some of the values on the surface, we can make evaluations and determine if we need to make values lighter, or in this case darker in areas, so that certain areas appear a little bit lighter. We'll go ahead and gradually start filling in some of the details of the lower portion of the snout here. You can see we've defined the mouth and filled that in for the most part, but if you look closely at it, it's just a collection of lines, so it's not a solid application of ink here. And as we begin to work some of the contours or some of the edges, the outer contours of the horse, in this case this horse's hair is kind of long around the edges, so we'll extend out a few strokes to illustrate this, and it's a good idea to have some variance in the line. You'll see that some of the strokes go a little bit longer than others, and that creates a more natural appearance of hair. Now we're working to the front side of the face, and the values are lighter here, so you can see I'm leaving a lot of the white of the paper showing through here with just some sparse mark making. That will help to create the illusion that we do have a value, but it's a lighter value, and we can see this in contrast with some of the darker values in the midtones that we've already developed. And even here we need to consider our directional stroking. You'll notice that the strokes I'm making are now different. They're flowing in a different direction, and all of this is determined basically by just looking at the horse, looking at the photo reference that I'm working from, and you can really see the direction that the hair is growing, and that's helping to that's helping me to make the decisions on which direction I should make the line in certain areas. Now down here around the nostrils, we have a few dots and a few stray marks or more organic marks here as the texture changes here as well. And of course we want to communicate this in the drawing. So here I'm adding some of the detail marks, some of the information down here, the lower portion of the mouth, that's important. But then I'm going back with some hatching just to develop the values here, just to develop some of the shadows. Now the front part of the head of the horse definitely has a white spot, so we'll just simply outline that using lines that mimic the direction that the hair grows in this section. So we're not having hard edged lines here. The outer edge or the outer contour of this white shape is actually made by drawing lines that mimic the hair in this section. Then we'll simply continue working our way up to the top of the head, again with directional stroking here, gradually building up the range of value and also the illusion of texture. And as you can probably tell, this process is one that requires patience. We have to make all of these little marks by hand in this case, and this takes time, and it also takes a bit of your thought process is very important here. You have to think about what you're doing when you're making these marks as well. So it's very important, if you're going to be a pen and ink artist, to be patient and just work slowly and deliberately. And as you can probably see here, there's quite a bit of forgiveness in pen and ink, even though a lot of people believe that there's not. A lot of people believe that when you start making marks with ink, since the marks are so permanent, then it must be a difficult medium to work with. And it's really very forgiving, especially when you're working on a drawing like this that is an organic subject. We can make lots and lots of little marks in there, and usually when you're in the middle of making a mistake, you usually recognize that before you go too far into that process with so many different small marks. So applying ink, whether it's with a brush or a pen, is actually more forgiving than a lot of people give it credit for. So here we switched over to working on the mane, and as you can see here, the texture is clearly different than that of the hair on the body of the horse. So this means that we need to approach it slightly differently. And it may look difficult to achieve this, but it's actually just a matter of changing the way we approach the way we're drawing the mane here. It's clearly different. So how is it different? Well, with the mane, we have basically collections of hair that overlap each other. So we're thinking about the hair, instead of being short and close to the body like the hair on the body of the horse, we're thinking about the hair as basically shapes. And these shapes go over the top of each other, they overlap each other, and we're going to make directional strokes in each section of that shape to mimic the way that the hair grows in that section. And another thing you'll notice is, in order to create the illusion of the form of each collection of hair, we need to have some highlights in there, and we also need to have some shadows as well. The highlights are going to happen on the upper portion of each collection of the hair, and then the shadows are going to happen where the hair overlaps and on the lower portion of each little section of hair. So we're going to concentrate the marks in the areas of shadow to create those darker values that we need, and then we're going to leave more space of the paper showing through in the areas where we see the highlights. And then you'll see I'm going back to the first part of the mane periodically and making some of the values a little bit darker. And again, that goes along with what we've already mentioned before about the relative nature of value, where when we have values in a certain location, they may appear darker than they need to be just because of the values around it. So once we get some of the values in place, we can always go back and adjust the values that we've already got on the surface. Right, now that we've got the mane in place and the front part of the head, the rest of the process is just a little bit tedious here. We're still going to continue our directional stroking here, and you can see as we work our way down the neck of the horse, down to the upper part of the body, we're just continuing that mark making where we're creating strokes, and then we're concentrating those strokes in the area where the value is darker. And as long as we get the value relationships as close as possible to that of what we're observing on the subject, then we're going to create the illusion of form as well. And you can see we're starting to create the illusion of the form of the body of the horse. So even though we have a lot of directional strokes that are going in the same direction, we're also creating that form underneath all that hair as well. And here on the front part of the horse, where we have the chest, the directional strokes are going to change here because, of course, the hair is growing in a slightly different direction, but also the form of the horse changes as well. So we can use that directional stroking to further communicate that in our drawing. There's quite a bit of shadow down here as well, since our light source is originating mainly from directly above the horse. The light source is slightly on the right side, but mainly directly above. So we're going to have a higher concentration of darker values on this lower portion. So once we've finished off the last bit of mark making here for our pen and ink drawing, we can always go back and darken up the background, but in this case I think the horse looks nice contrasting against that white background. We can go back and make a few adjustments here and add a few more darker values in areas of shadow once we've got a good idea of our value relationships. And then of course, after our ink has dried completely, we can erase all the remaining pencil marks to reveal our finished pen and ink drawing of a horse.